I'm Dr. Bridget Kustin. I'm an economic anthropologist and a research fellow at the Said Business School.
Hi, I'm Dr. Zainab Kabba. I am Associate Director at the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship here at the University of Oxford. I direct our educational programs and our research activities.
Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and I am an MBA student at Said Business School, originally from Toronto, Canada. Before entering the MBA program, I was a management consultant and looking forward to some of the discussion items we'll be covering today.
Hi, I'm Rohit Anand. I'm from India and I'm an MBA student here. Before coming to this MBA, I was working in technology field and I was working with a bank in London.
Great, thank you everyone. We're having this discussion because intersectionality and inclusion, the topic of our series here at the Said Business School, is a complex one. And there isn't a single view that's correct. There are smart people who can disagree about best approaches. These issues are complex and they're sensitive. And so that's why we wanted to bring together students, professionals, social entrepreneurs, academics to talk about what some of these ideas mean and how they're unfolding based on all of our unique vantage points. Our first session in the series is going to be led by Zainab. So Zainab, why don't you explain for us what that session is going to be about?
Thanks, Bridget. So the session that we're having on Tuesday, November 19th at 4:30 p.m. Is going to use the issue of the skin disorder of albinism to start a conversation about what it means to talk about intersectionality on a global level. We'll have representatives from Sesame Street, the children's television programming, to talk about the work that they've done both in the US as well as in parts of sub-Saharan Africa that really address issues around race, ethnicity, and we will also be in conversation with representatives from a group of medical professionals that deal with skin diseases in different parts of the world. And they'll be talking about the ways in which that they have been in their work have had to deal with some of these challenges related to race and skin disorders. The last person that we'll have on that panel will be Deandra Forrest. And I mentioned her name. She is a model, and she has the skin disorder of albinism. And we'll talk a bit more during this session about what albinism is, how that has affected and animated her work, her experience individually, and the work that she is looking to do both with this group of medical doctors as well as Sesame Workshop to really address this issue in a global context.
So this brings us to the title of this series, Intersectionality and Inclusion. The whole point of intersectionality is that it is not additive. It doesn't require us to choose or to create a hierarchy and say that we're looking at race at the expense of putting time and resources toward other elements of one's identity, be it disability, gender, sexual orientation. The whole point is to understand that we need to look at people as deeply unique because of how their entity is accumulation of many different factors, probably too many to even enumerate. And that to look at people in this unique way is to take us closer to what Zainab referenced, which is this isn't about a business case or taking a box. This is about human dignity and human equity and human flourishing. And saying that we want someone only because of their race reduces that deep complexity in humanity down to a single attribute. And so here's where a lot of the messaging and approaches, while good intentioned to diversity, equity, and inclusion, can be dehumanizing because they reduce people and their identity and their complexity and their flourishing down to a single attribute. So we're not just looking at race, we're looking at intersectional racism. And once we're able to make that shift mentally, we're also able to identify certain gaps that currently exist and certain blind spots. So for example, in the UK higher education, there has been tremendous strides made about the inclusion of women as professors, as postdoctoral affiliates, and strides have been made on including women, but you parse the data and you realize that it's white women who've benefited, and there have not been commensurate gains made for Black and brown women in higher education, professorial roles in the UK. If we don't have an intersectional approach to these issues, then certain groups will continue to be left out for a wide variety of reasons. And so in making this series about intersectionality and inclusion, we actually want to get away from a zero-sum approach to these issues, whereby it's seen as granting attention to one group is taking attention away to the other. Instead, we want to start to build an integrated approach to thinking about equity, and that means an intersectional approach.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that was summed up quite nicely, Bridget. I think you've hit all of the points. And I think what we see here, I think particularly, in some of my experiences, and you mentioning about kind of like even like gender and like how disaggregating data can really help us provide insights into what we mean by actually taking and looking at this from an intersectional lens. And I think, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about this is hard. But, we, especially in a university, we study difficult things all the time, right? And that's part of the work to really understand this from those multiple lenses. And, I would say, especially when we're talking about race, it is very nuanced, depending upon where you are. So in the UK, we obviously use the Bain category, but once again, that allows us to miss out on the ways in which certain racial and ethnic groups are actually being disadvantaged or aggressed in certain areas, because we kind of lump everything together. So I think it's important, what Bridget was saying about recognizing that it is about looking at this in a very detailed, nuanced way, intersectionally, to understand how we can actually address some of these concerns. So I think it's definitely not I think to your question, Jenny, about what is most urgent. It's just that this work is urgent, and we don't need to play the victim or pain Olympics to determine, who deserves more attention or whatever. That we're going to recognize that these things are going to intersect at various points, and we need to understand what that means.
Kimberly Crenshaw, who first came up with the word intersectionality, is a lawyer. And this emerged out of her work as a legal scholar, saying that there are categories that do not accommodate the complexity of identity. And we have to start to talk about the law in a way that can be more expansive to accommodate these complexities of the self. This series is being led by executive education because these topics aren't just the domain of undergraduate or MBA students. This is for lifelong learning. This is for senior professionals, senior executives. Everyone from C-suite down needs to be thinking about these topics and coming up with plans to address them, both in their corporations and in their everyday lives. And so the series is really geared toward everyone, from senior executives down to students, and we hope that everyone tunes in. So with that, let's get started with our discussion.
Sounds good. Thanks, Bridget. So I'm going to kick us off with some of the discussion questions. So the first one actually flows very nicely with what Bridget was mentioning of what do companies usually get wrong about diversity?
So I think I'll start off with some reflections on that. I think at the inception of the conversation is really about creating, definitions and understanding of what these concepts mean. I think part of the challenge has been with organizations about not actually articulating what they mean by diversity. So then that leaves it open for employees, staff members, people from various areas that impact the organization, or who are engaging with the organization to interpret what they mean by diversity. So I think as a starting point, it's really about having a conversation about what that means. There's often confusion between representation and diversity. So people might say, oh goodness, no, we have, our staff body actually is representative of our wider community. So we are actually doing well and doing okay. While others might say, we have a lot of different people in our organization that are made up of different races and ethnicities. So we are diverse. And I think part of that is that challenge about the message that is being communicated about what diversity is. And then how that kind of intersects with understandings of inclusion and equity, right? So it's not just that we want to bring in people from diverse backgrounds, but we want to make sure that there's actually value that they see for themselves in those organizations. So I think that's part of the challenge, and one, kind of the absence of the definitions, or the lack of clarity, I would say. I think another point I would add is, there's almost like a reductive element to looking at the issue. We look perhaps one stage beyond ourselves, maybe just our organization, right? So we don't widen the scope of our understanding of what our constituency is. So with example, a business, you might say, we have diverse leadership and people feel included, and we are working in that way to be inclusive. But then there are all the people that are affected by what that business actually does. And I think with only kind of a tunnel vision understanding of what that means for the people inside the organization that actually carry out the work per se, there isn't necessarily a focus on beyond that, the people that are affected by those people. You're situated, for instance, in a certain community. How is the work that you're doing? How does that actually, are you being diverse in the way in which you're thinking about that, the people that are impacted by the work and things that you do? So I think this is kind of like the point, I think, in some ways of our conversation about looking at it beyond sort of just the walls of that organization. I think those are some of the two things I would say as a starting point that companies often miss out given conversations around diversity.
I agree with everything that Zainab has said. I would add to that what companies also get wrong about diversity is thinking that diversity alone suffices, and that if you have a more diverse workforce, that you've solved the problem and you've ticked the boxes. But that places all of the onus on literally the bodies of those non-white people to somehow do the work by virtue of being there. Whereas the conversation that we need to be having is for the people who represent the majority in their given circumstance. So take the United States, for white people, that they don't need to just be bringing in others, they need to look within and they need to look at the organization. So structural racism is really what we're talking about when we're having this kind of conversation, and understanding how the algorithms that power software, how the suppliers of our pens and papers, how grievance procedures, processes for making decisions, processes for disagreeing with those decisions, whose voice ultimately counts both officially and unofficially in shadow processes. This is what matters. It's not just hiring people, that matters too, but it's about understanding that true inclusion and true equity isn't possible unless you really do look at this whole picture and you look at the structure, both of the organization and then the society in which it's located.
I would like to add on that point, actually. So from an MBA student perspective, we study about systems and control and structure. So I don't think diversity, the responsibility of the companies stop at just creating a diverse workforce or hiring a diverse employee set. I think you have to facilitate that culture, to create that structure, to create that controls and system, which facilitates all the functioning and communication between diverse employees. I worked in an organization which was quite diverse, and there were many people. But then there was internal boundaries in the company. So we have to facilitate a communication between those workforce and create a culture which improves the inclusion and communication between those.
But I also grant that understanding structural racism is going to be difficult because its very nature is to render itself invisible. That's what structures are. We don't think about building foundations when we walk on a floor and trust it to not collapse below us. We don't think about power lines when we flip a switch to get electricity. We just assume that these things are there and that they'll work. So it's I recognize that we're dealing with something that to a lot of people might be very difficult to grasp conceptually, because if they can't see it, then how do you know it's there?
I think that's a really good point, Bridget. And I would say, I think part of this, in terms of what companies do around this, is really making the invisible visible, and finding ways to do that is embedded within the institution itself and is not one required by one person or another. So I think you were saying earlier, in terms of those structures, and how then are those structures then amended in order to actually make the invisible visible, so that we can actually see this and it isn't kind of hiding in the crevices in some ways, or it's the onus isn't on one person or one set of people to actually be able to articulate what these challenges are.
And who gets to amend them? What you were just saying, the fact that it shouldn't just be the minority employees or the junior employees who make the changes, but that it takes strong leadership. It takes the people at the top, the senior members of staff, to decide that they are not vulnerable, they are not junior, and they'll still take these issues on, even if it doesn't, let's say, personally influence them because they're not a minority.
I mean, coming back to point, I mean, what do you think a good leader, or and what is absent from response of leaders who facilitate inclusivity or diversity in an organization? So can you please discuss about that?
I think something that Bridget just said is really important around who the onus is upon to kind of, engage with this work at a structural level. I think where I've seen good leaders engage in this is where they have not then put the responsibility on individuals who are being aggressed in the workplace to actually have to make those changes. And I think that's very difficult to do, because I think often in conversations around when we're talking about race particularly, there seems to be almost this assumption that the person of color has to be the one to discuss and talk about how they have been, aggressed in the workplace or have had certain experiences. And I think part of that is necessary and is important to hear those stories, to understand what those experiences are, because we really can't truly address anything if we don't actually know what's going on. But at the same time, we haven't really asked or required from senior leadership, and often, individuals who are not color, so what and how they have actually contributed to that. So, even thinking about how we begin to kind of have a paradigm shift and flip the conversation, and having those uncolored people who are in senior positions of leadership to talk about the ways in which they have contributed to these this workplace, rather than completely leaving the onus upon the individuals to sort of articulate that, especially when oftentimes there aren't enough mechanisms or internal structures that would allow them to do that safely without having any kind of negative repercussions on their positions within their organizations.
Something that I've been hearing in the research that I do with large family businesses is that in an era of being put on blast on Twitter, in an era of social media callouts, there is a lot of fear of, as Zainab said, the uncolored people who need to be champions. There's a lot of fear of getting it wrong, of making a faux pas, of using a term that made sense 30 years ago, but doesn't make sense anymore because language has moved past it, and that this fear can be paralytic. And so here's where this intersects really nicely with the school's work and executive education's work on leadership, because at a certain point, people are going to have to be brave and have to be willing to perhaps use the wrong word, get it wrong, admit that they're still learning as they're doing. But personally, I think that I don't see a way around that unless people can get to a point of bravery and of a willingness to accept criticisms that might come, unless we have leaders willing to take that on, then it's going to be very hard for this to move beyond a niche issue that only activists or that only people of color are going to be presumed to be the champions of. And that's, that doesn't address structural racism.
Yeah, I think another important point that really distinguishes good leaders from great leaders is the duration of their involvement. So I know there are some leaders that may see diversity and inclusion as more of a buzzword, it's a destination, but I would think that great leaders see this more as a process. It's never ending, you never achieve perfect diversity or perfect inclusion. I think within the firm, I think what leaders should be cognizant of is that they're educating their employees on a daily basis. It should be integrated into the company's weekly, monthly processes of just educating all of the employees on why diversity and inclusion is even important in the first place. And being in the MBA program, we've done a lot of readings on why this is very critical to having a successful company. But what I do see in some of the companies I work with is this is not something that that leaders have a very proactive approach on taking, of just making sure that their employees are educated on the importance of this, and that this is something that is regularly communicated.
I think what I'll add there, you know, to Rohit's earlier question about, you know, what has been interesting to see, or, you know, that has been absent as well as good from leaders in the space. You know, I think part of it is, you know, where and how organizations begin to move beyond the business case for this work is where I feel that businesses and organizations will truly be successful. I think if we continue to rely, I mean, we operate in a business school, we've done research around like businesses, we know, you know, diverse teams that are, you know, equitable and are inclusive, that they have a positive net effect on the way in which the organization will flourish financially or otherwise. I think we have to move beyond that conversation and recognize that this is something that we have to do, and that organizations need to take this on board. We're done with the business case right now. I think we're beyond that conversation. And I think where we see organizations that are not focused around that and essentially saying this is the work that we have to do, I think those are the organizations that are actually going to be leading the way in the future.
So on that topic, Zainab, I think that flows well into our next question of, for these firms, there's many aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So which one is the most urgent that firms should be focusing on? Would it be things like gender, race, socioeconomic background? Which ones do you think we are falling the most behind on?
So given our conversation and talking about fuzzy language and language, Black Lives Matter, a phrase that scares people, a term that emboldens others, a term that's around for quite some time in various ways. How, if at all, has Black Lives Matter and everything that has happened over the last 6 to 9 months changed the way in which we talk about diversity?
In my view, I think a Black Lives Matter moment, I'll say it a moment which came this year, has started a conversation about various differences we see in our society. I mean, given I come from, we have a kind of, we have a very, very diverse culture and a very diverse population in my country. But then there are certain divisions which needs to be amended and which needs to be fixed. I mean, this moment obviously gives a opportunity to start discussing and in fact, find ways where we can amend those problems which we have in our country of division between North and South, or rich and poor, or class division, or a caste division in my country. So this is an opportune time we can start having a discussion. I'm not sure if there has been a very big discussion coming up or in there, but it has obviously the universities, some of the universities, leading universities at my place, have started discussing these things in their forums. But I think leadership is, the central leadership, the high leadership is still lacking, and they still don't recognize it as a most important aspect. I think one thing which when I was here, I think I saw that during this pandemic which came in, there is certain difference. It created a difference between people. Like the students were out of school and they had to study from home. So I think at that moment also there were certain divisions, and government wanted to put everyone in school because some people might not have enough resources to study at home. So and this might be dependent on, so I mean, might not be even across all the races and sections of society. So I think even in that aspect, there were a few discussions in UK how to help people and how students should not stay behind from a particular community or race or some of these. So there has been efforts, I guess, somewhere, but yeah, a concrete effort I haven't seen yet. Just
to add sort of my perspective, I'm also I work between Canada and the United States, so I actually have, it's a similar perspective, but being in Canada where it's a fairly diverse composition of our population, and what I noticed after Black Lives Matter began is that, especially for corporations, it gave them the necessary push to start talking about some potentially uncomfortable topics, which originally they were sort of moved to the side because of the level of difficulty to have those conversations, especially in a corporate setting where originally a lot of the focus was on how can we expand our business, how we can give better value to our shareholders. Now it's more of the important topics of what can we do to support Black Lives Matter and what do each of our individual roles play.
So the phrase Columbusing refers to a white person proclaiming to discover something new that has in fact been around for a long time. And I think it's really important for people who are new to these topics, and there are many of them, and we're all in different stages of our learning journey, hence the need for continual lifelong learning. But it's important for all of us to recognize that the concept that Black lives matter and should matter both legally, matter economically, this is not new. And this takes us back to debates between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. This takes us back to Stokely Carmichael testifying before US Congress in 1970. None of the ideas that are circulating now are new. And so it's worth understanding, why has it taken so long for us to get to the present moment? Why is it that it took a video of an extrajudicial murder? Why is it that a video was needed to spark this? And why wasn't it that we simply believed Black people when they were saying that they were in danger and being killed? And these are some of the really uncomfortable questions that I think truly moving forward in these conversations requires everyone to think about, because since these conversations and debates aren't new, what is it about the present moment that suddenly brought us to a point where they could no longer be ignored? Part of it is about consumers and about popular uprisings. And as Jenny said, about a political mobilization that made this so pressing that suddenly corporations have to sit up and take note. But whatever the reason, once we start to parse what allowed for inaction for so long and what are the structures that facilitated that inaction, then we can start to think about what it would mean to undo those structures that allowed people to be silent. And that's also a way to understand structural racism and its invisibility, and to render it visible is to think about, what allowed people to not care for so long. And if we can think about what it means to have them care, not just for a moment, but as Jenny said earlier, for a longue durée, moving into a future without end, then that is what it means to start to build a more equitable institution.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about what this really means from a business perspective, in some ways, and how businesses have contributed to the issues that we've just mentioned, and the historical nature of this, and recognizing that we are in a moment in time in which we are discussing this in a very different way, but this isn't something that hasn't been discussed, or people have not been dying for, or marching for, et cetera, for decades. I think when we look at what has happened, I think in many ways the pandemic really allowed this to come to the forefront of public discourse in a way that it hadn't been before, primarily because we were all stuck at home, and in many ways a lot of the distractions and things that we probably would have had that would have allowed us to kind of keep on moving weren't present. That being said, we have to recognize that as much as so much has been talking about, all of this has been talked about in the public domain, this is still happening, right? So, we see that this conversation has brought to the fore just, much more of sort of like diversity bypassing, right? Of like, oh, I don't see color, right? You know, and this is just sort of something now that is becoming so normalized, both in institutions, in organizations, and businesses. And that's something that we kind of need to think about and how to address it from a business perspective. I think what it also highlights is that thinking again beyond the immediate, this issue of Black Lives Matter is not, you know, looking at what's happened in the US and what has kind of sparked that in the conversation globally, but how are then businesses contributing to this in the way in which they are structuring themselves and their processes and their supply chains? How are they then supporting these kind of systems that force people to be out on the street to say Black Lives Matter? You know, so it's not this, well, you know, once we recognize Black Lives Matter, so we'll have Black people in our organizations and then things will be fine. It's really trying to think and look at, there are multiple points on the journey, if you will, multiple points in terms of how organizations are structured. And I think it really requires, if organizations and businesses want to take on board the concept of Black Lives Matter and actually embed that and live it, it needs to be something that starts, yes, from leadership and an organization, that sort of thing, but then flows out to their communities, to their supply chains, and what does that mean? So it's fine for you to have a Black CEO, but if the people who are driving all of your trucks are on, like, you know, 0-hour contracts and you're suffering, you're also contributing and demonstrating the fact that Black lives don't matter. So we need to make sure the conversation is fully embedded into the way in which businesses and organizations think about how they structure themselves.
Now, let's presume we have an organization that wants to make change, and there's good intention, there's a desire to reform, uncover invisible structural racism and make it better. What happens when well-intentioned people disagree? How do organizations move forward given the complexity of these issues? Whose voice gets to win out?
Moving on to the next question, I would like to ask you, how can people in positions of privilege support others?
The first thing to do is examine one's intention, because if you are engaging in anti-racist work in order to have people like you, in order to get recognition, in order to somehow get a cookie for good behavior, then that is not the way to approach these topics, because you're still fundamentally keeping privilege intact. And more importantly, you're keeping yourself centered in the process. And if one is privileged and genuinely wants to help, then that has to require an attempt to undo how one can, from the micro to the macro, to undo one's own position of privilege. And that means giving something up. It might mean giving up your time, your bandwidth. It might mean giving up your calm, static life, because you might get angry, you might get upset, you might get emotional and you have to control that. It might mean giving up an opportunity and suggesting another colleague for that opportunity. It might mean not passing an opportunity on to a friend or colleague that you feel you owe a favor to them, you know, and it might mean bringing someone new into that position or that role. So the short answer is that people who are in positions of privilege to do this work need to do it without ego or without expecting anything in return, because it's that expectation of something in return that keeps privilege intact.
Yeah, I'll add to what Bridget is saying. I think, like, fundamentally we also have to recognize this is about power. And if someone is in a position of privilege, they have to be willing to have some sort of paradigm shift to recognize that there needs to be a sharing of power. And you know, that varies from situation to situation. I think secondly, there should be an acknowledgement that you have to risk something. You have to be willing to risk something. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that this is hard. But if you really want to be about this work, I think people in positions of power and have privilege need to accept that they have to risk something. There's no, for instance, you often have cases where there might be a situation where someone was aggressed in the workplace, and someone might have been watching that. And then instead of at that time addressing it in some way, they might watch it, see it all happen, and then go to that person and say, oh my goodness, I'm really sorry for what happened. I saw that, it was so unfair. That's not helping that person. You are now giving them an added burden that they have to actually support you and the feelings that you've just had about the situation that you witnessed, and they have to now interact with you. So I think, part of that is, I think, leading to my third point about accountability. They have to be willing to hold people to account. And they have to be willing to support the introduction of accountability mechanisms in structures that will hold people to account in the event that people disagree. So there are a lot of things that in society that people might not want to do or might disagree about, but fundamentally there are structures in place that are aimed at supporting vulnerable peoples, that are aimed at supporting and helping people that are in situations where there is definitely a power dynamic. So I would say that's definitely the three key things. The last thing I would say is you have to tell the truth. We have to, something very simple, just tell the truth. Tell the truth about who we are, tell the truth about our organization, who we're trying to be, the mistakes that we have made, just being transparent and truthful about the circumstances is really important. And I think without a number of those things, this kind of work won't really get done.
Zainab, I agree absolutely that privilege is about power, which is why people are often loath to have less of it. But if privilege is about power, then what do we do with deeply hierarchical corporations where there is a leader? There are people who are meant to have power, and that is structurally built into organizations. What about those people who can't and won't cede their power for structural reasons? How do those people in positions of privilege make a difference?
Jenny, Rohit, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think if, those people, they even have more responsibility to work on this. They have, as Janet said, they have to come into open and accept that organization needs to move in a certain way which promotes inclusivity between people, and have to put a structure. So I very much agree with Janet's point of view, like accept it that there are things, there are differences, and that has to come from the top of the leadership, and that will have to push down into organization, or have to create a culture which promotes.
I think my view on this one is this could be even though they have a lot of power, which may sometimes be a bad thing, it can also be a good thing in certain time periods. I think with power, again, comes a lot of great responsibility, and they actually have the opportunity to share this power, whether it might not be formal power, but it can be sense in just giving credibility to what others may say. So for for myself as middle management, if I'm trying to initiate a conversation about either diversity or inclusion, adding credibility to that and really trying to promote this across a company because they have such a wide reach and they're such a respected figure, it gives everyone sort of that stamp of approval that this is something that the company should be discussing on a day-to-day basis, and a very important element of, say, a corporate strategy. And I think another element of that is just from my personal experience, the very strong leaders the leaders that I look up to are the ones that do have these uncomfortable conversations and really try to ensure that everyone's employees, regardless of their position, they have an opinion on this, and that their views are heard and that they're involved in this. So I think that's another potential way of someone who may have a higher level of authority can distribute that across the firm. So to wrap up the event, we have one final question. Just curious on if there are any regional or sector differences that are important for us to discuss before we wrap up this event.
I think I'm an American living in England. That comes with its own kind of presuppositions and background and experiences. I think with this conversation, especially in England, and I think this often happens, you know, for us at the business school, there is a propensity to import the approaches, ways of thinking from the US here to understand the ways in which intersectionality, inclusion, conversations around diversity operate within the English, within England overall. I think here at the university, I think we are kind of embedded in a very deep history in ways that are very different from the US, you know, and the role of the British Empire in violence and aggression across nations for long periods of time and leading up to today, and the ways in which we are kind of feeling the after effects of that and see that all around us in sort of the institutional structures. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that each of these different countries have various histories that impact the way in which people will engage with this topic. What it means to be a Black man in the UK as opposed to a Black man in the US is very different. So I think that those nuances are really important to think about. Also just the way in which the countries are structured. I think that's really, really important to say. So I think definitely there are regional differences. And I think the thing that we have to think about the regional differences are, how does the history impact the way we actually see these issues? How does it animate the lives of the people? How do the rules and regulations that have been built into, you know, the US, when you think about things like affirmative action as an example, which aren't present in the UK, and then conversations around diversity, which then scare people and then make them feel like, oh, the idea of meritocracy is being completely disavowed. All of these things I think are really important to recognize that there are regional differences, and we have to kind of very much dig ourselves quite deep into understanding the history, the lives of people, and how these issues actually animate them, rather than looking at solutions or approaches that have been implemented in other places, and then kind of adopting them wholesale. Not that we can't look at those. I think it's worthwhile in terms of a comparison and understanding how those things have shaped or perhaps solved certain issues, but really need to be intentional about what that means for us in the UK.
So the answer to the question brings us back to intersectionality. And as Zainab rightly pointed out, it brings the centrality of history squarely into the present. And it also highlights the degree to which, for this work, there aren't shortcuts. And ticking a box is easy, but understanding what led to a population to be marginalized or to not have power, to not have privilege, only once you understand that history can you start to understand the role of your company in perpetuating it, in profiting off it. And only in understanding that can you then start to chart a pathway forward. So all of these issues require very bespoke solutions. And as a school, we are not engaging on this work in order to create a set of steps that works across every jurisdiction. We're engaging in this work because in order for people to embark on that bespoke journey, they have to know how to think and they have to know how to approach these issues. And so that's what this series is doing, is introducing some of the concepts, the vocabulary, the salient topics, and the questions that one needs to ask to begin this work. The regional and sectoral differences are absolutely critical. Black Lives Matter in the United States is indivisible from the history of slavery in the United States. In other parts of the world, colonial or imperialist histories are going to be most critical. But it's also worth noting that an intersectional lens requires us to understand that liberation struggles have traditionally crossed borders, and there have always been alliances among both the disempowered and the elite. And so the story becomes very complex and becomes very transnational quite quickly. For those of you who might be watching this or who will watch the series who aren't privileged, powerful executives, but perhaps are watching this to understand how you should navigate your company as a rank and file employee, or if you're a student watching this, then understand that educating yourself is not an indulgent task or something that's suitable only for people who have the luxury for taking a couple weeks off to do an executive education course. It sounds cheesy, but to educate yourself is to take a very radical step forward. Because in the UK, for example, it was shocking to me as an American how colonial history is not widely taught from an early age, not at all. In the United States, the history of US foreign wars and imperialist acts are not widely taught. There's lots of Americans who do not agree that slavery in the US was an unmitigated horror. So it is false to believe that there are shared histories and shared bases of knowledges that everyone sort of knows and agrees upon. It is a radical thing to educate yourself about what is happening for the populations that live near you and what your sector or your company what their involvement or proximity to these histories might be. So education, and we're biased, we're educators, we're coming to you from a university, but in this case, education is absolutely both a starting point and a continual process to happen along the journey.